Today's video is called COVID and the Covenanters. If you're familiar with church history, you've heard of the Covenanters. And I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the history of the Church of Scotland because it is relevant for our time. So I'd like to start just very briefly just telling you about a fellow by the name of Patrick Hamilton. He lived from 1504 to 1528. He was an incredibly strong preacher. He came from a privileged family, but he was a strong preacher of justification by faith alone. He'd been influenced by Luther. He was, of course, investigated by the authorities. He was arrested. He was released, but he kept on preaching. And finally, he was charged with heresy, and he was burned at St. Andrews in 1528. Also, around this time, there was what was called the Privy Kirk movement. Privy being private and Kirk being church. And these were small churches that actually met privately outside of the authority of the state church at that time, which was the Church of England. During this time also, there was another, just a great leader, George Wishart. He was a strong preacher of the gospel, but Wishart was always on the run. He was always being persecuted from town to town, but he was always preaching while he was going. So on the run, but always preaching. He was arrested for heresy. He refused to recant, and he was burned at the stake at St. Andrews in 1546. Now, I should tell you that it wasn't that he was just burned at the stake. He was hanged to the very brink of death, then revived, and then burned at the stake. And there was a strong reaction on the part of the Scottish people to Wishart's martyrdom. Now, Wishart had a bodyguard, a short, stout guy with a big beard by the name of John Knox. And it was under the leadership of John Knox that the Church of Scotland experienced Reformation. But the Church of Scotland really was in a sense, it was always a church that was in opposition to the state. In other countries, at the time of the Reformation, you had countries that embraced the Protestantism, and so church and state worked in conjunction with each other. But the Church of Scotland was in a constant battle for its life. And in fact, the church in Scotland was really born in resistance and lived in a state of resistance for quite a long time. Now, Scotland actually gave birth to, by the grace of God, to brilliant theologians and to powerful preachers. But the church also, even in its most flourishing times, was extremely familiar with persecution. And so Charles I wanted to see episcopacy imposed on the Church of Scotland. The episcopal form of government was the form of government in the Church of England. Charles I was also an Erastian, which meant that he believed that the state actually exercised authority over the church. Civil authority had authority over ecclesiastical matters. And of course, as the head of the church in England, he believed that the king was indeed the head of the church. This ends up leading to some tremendous persecution under the Arminian Archbishop William Laud. And under William Laud, of course, and Charles I, many good and godly men suffered because they would not compromise their principles on the Word of God, on the nature of the church, on who is the head of the church, and the nature of the true gospel. So during these times, though, God was incredibly faithful to send revival to the persecuted church as well. And so under the preaching of men like David Dixon and John Livingston, there was tremendous revival, wonderful accounts of revival, special communion seasons that had prolonged or protracted preaching were signaled by the blessing of God's Spirit. But Charles I, of course, was relentless in his persecution of of these men and these churches. And so in 1638, ministers and nobles and peasants across Scotland signed what was called the National Covenant. And really, it was an appeal to the nation to unite against Charles I. And so the covenant was called was a call, I should say, to uphold the true gospel, the true church, and to resist all contrary human powers. Some of these men, as they gathered at Greyfriars, signed that covenant with their own blood. Of course, Charles took military action, and a lot of details that we're skipping over, but then there was a civil war in England. And when that civil war, so Parliament against, which by that was the Puritan side, parliamentary army, and then Charles' army, his royalist army. So many actually then signed in 1643 what was called the Solemn League and Covenant. And that was actually made by both the English and the Scots. It was an agreement between the Parliament and the Scottish Church, or the Scottish Kirk. And during this time, for instance, there was the Great Westminster Assembly, the collaboration of the Westminster Standards, the Confession of Faith, larger catechism, shorter catechism, the Directory of Public Worship, things like that. But there was a Scottish representative at the Westminster Assembly by the name of George Gillespie, and he had written a profoundly powerful work called Aaron's Rod Blossoming. And in that work, he laid out the relationship biblically between the civil and ecclesiastical authorities. Now, as Christian living today, where I live, I wouldn't necessarily agree with all of his conclusions, but he had a number of principles that he outlined, and that was that both civil and ecclesiastical authority have their authority from God, but their authority is distinct. In a sense, Gillespie said Christ has a twofold kingdom, and that kingdom on the one hand extends over the magistrate, but then Christ has what is his essential kingdom, his eternal kingdom, and that is over the church, over the word, over sacraments, so forth. And so, although the civil authority has a function, a legitimate and proper function, and Christians should obey the civil authorities never have the right to exert itself or impose itself over Christ's essential kingdom, which is in the church. In other words, the civil authority has no authority over the Church of Christ. Well, in 1649, Charles I is executed, which, by the way, was a big deal. And John Owen preaches the sermon the day after the king was executed, and Oliver Cromwell comes to power, refuses to take the throne, but takes the title Lord Protector. And of course, there's some trouble between England and Cromwell, and I should say there's trouble between England and Cromwell, and then Scotland. And there's a lot of things that happen during that time, and Cromwell goes into Scotland and all of that. After that time, though, the Church of Scotland entered into some really stormy times. But those stormy times were sort of intramural storms. And you had people that had pastors that had signed an indulgence that permitted them to go back to their pulpits, and other pastors that didn't sign. And you had resolutionists and anti-resolutionists. And there was a lot of division in the church. And it was during that time that Durham wrote a book on the scandal of the church, which was dealing with divisions and schisms. So a little later, when Charles II, that is Charles I's son, ascends the throne, he comes in. He's the great deceiver. He reestablishes episcopacy in the Church of Scotland, outlaws the covenant, and then bans the small groups of Christians who met in what were called conventicles. Many in the Church of Scotland resisted, remaining true to the national covenant. And these men would be called Covenanters. In 1661, one of the brightest shining lights among the Covenanters, James Guthrie, was hanged near St. Giles in Edinburgh. His head was cut off and was hung on the Netherbow Port. This happened in 1661. James Guthrie's head remained on the Netherbow until 1688. In 1662, there was the Great Ejection. Those that couldn't sign the Act of Uniformity were banned from their churches, and so churches began to meet in barns and fields and in the middle of the night in order to avoid the dragoons, the enforcers for Charles II. There were so many martyrs during this time, many Covenanter martyrs. Jock Purves, in his book Fair Sunshine, one of the most moving little books you'll ever read, actually gives a number of these mini biographies of the martyrs. What was the Covenanters' creed, so to speak? Well, in a sense, it was the Westminster Standards. It was, of course, the National Covenant. But the heart of their creed was this: no king but Christ. And then from about 1680 to 1688, this was known as the Killing Times. The persecution was incredibly intense, and the Covenanters, for the most part, stayed incredibly faithful and strong in their loyalty to Christ as King and to his true church. Some of the Covenanters believed in passive resistance. Others believed in armed resistance, like the Lion of the Covenant, Richie Cameron. But men and women and children paid the price of remaining faithful and not bowing the knee to the tyrannical civil authority. Thankfully, the Killing Times came to an end with the glorious revolution of William of Orange and Mary in 1688. And so, to be sure, in America, we don't have a state church like the Church of Scotland. But the fact is that many of the principles that those men held to were precious to our colonial forefathers. And one of those principles ends up being expressed in our First Amendment, and that is that the state has no authority over the church. The state has no authority to establish religion or to prohibit the free exercise thereof. And so in these days of our constitutional liberties being suspended, we must resist the idea that the state can dictate to the church how she can worship, when and where she can worship. I've heard many say, well, we can still preach and live stream it, but make no mistake about it, this is a bigger issue than just being allowed to preach. When the state tells the church that she cannot assemble, that she cannot observe her public worship of God, that she cannot observe her ordinances like the Lord's Supper, then the civil authorities have swerved out of their lane of authority, and they're rivaling Christ as King of his church. Brothers and sisters, these are dangerous times, but we can learn from our covenanting forebears. These times may be more dangerous than we realize. But let me just say, COVID or no COVID, we have no king but Christ.